In this lesson, we're going to discuss musical notation. This is another form of musical learning and communication that we use in addition to our ears and our eyes. So one way of learning that you probably all know about is by rote or by ear. So you listen many times to something over and over and you can sort of memorize it and learn it that way. And that is great, and we absolutely have to have that skill. However, you can be even more versatile in your learning ability if you learn how to read notation. It's just the same as with any other language. If you can read it, you can get other information that you might not be able to get just by seeing somebody play or by hearing them play. So it's a very effective, efficient tool for learning how to play the drums. Music is typically notated on a staff. A staff has 5 lines, so sometimes the note heads are on the lines, but there are also 4 spaces in between the lines, and sometimes the note heads are in those spaces in between the lines. Where we place the note heads on the staff determines which instrument we're going to play. So the bass drum, for instance, is going to be on the bottom space of the staff, so the first space. And then the snare drum is typically notated on the 3rd space, so you skip a space and up to the 3rd space, that's where the snare drum goes. Cymbals, as we mentioned earlier, are usually notated with an X, and for the hi-hats, that X would be on top of the staff. Now we're going to notate our first beat. So you will see 4 X's across the top of the staff. The bass drum on counts 1 and 3, and then the snare drum on counts 2 and 4. The note heads are grouped together by a straight line that we call a stem. Now, if you have multiple instruments playing on the same beat, those note heads will all be grouped together by the same line, the same stem. Our first basic beat has 4 counts, and these 4 counts together are what we call a measure. Music notation has what's called a clef at the beginning of the line. High-pitched instruments use what's called a treble clef, and low-pitched instruments typically use what's called a bass clef. In percussion or drum set, we're not playing pitched instruments necessarily, so we use a percussion clef, which is usually just 2 lines at the beginning of the staff. Next to the clef sign, you'll see what looks like a fraction. This is not actually a fraction, but it's referred to as a time signature. Now, there's a top number and a bottom number. The top number signifies how many beats or counts are in that particular measure, and the bottom number signifies what type of note gets the count. Our first basic beat is in 4/4, so we would count that 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it sounds like this. There are many different time signatures, even though 4/4 is the most common. So, for instance, if I play only 3 beats in the measure or in the pattern, it's 3/4 time signature. It sounds like this: 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You can also have 5 as the top number in the time signature, and that would sound like this. So far, we've been dealing only with one measure at a time, and we've just been repeating that one measure. But in notation, there is a repeat sign. And what it looks like is 2 dots, then a thin line, and a thick line. And that indicates that we repeat that measure at least one time. There are many different types of note values. So far, we've been dealing only with 4 notes per measure, and those notes are referred to as quarter notes, because if you have a full measure and you divide it by 4, each note gets the value of a quarter of that measure. Think about it just like how a dollar is divided into 4 quarters. Another note value is called a whole note. This note takes up the whole value of an entire measure. It looks like a dot with a hole in the middle, so like a donut, and it does not have a stem. This whole note is equal to 4 quarter notes. When an instrument like a trumpet or a trombone plays a whole note, they can play a note that is the length of the entire measure. Now, if I were to play a whole note on the snare drum, it might not ring for all 4 counts, but it can still be notated as a whole note. So I will play 4 quarter notes on the bass drum and then just whole notes on the snare drum. 1, 2, ready, go. The next note value is a half note. It looks like a quarter note but has a hole in the middle of the note head. So it's like a whole note with a stem. That's called a half note. It receives 2 quarter notes or half the length of a whole note. Any type of instrument that sustains, like a wind instrument or even a guitar, can play a half note at the full length, the full value of that note. But again, the snare drum, for instance, might not ring that whole time, but we can still play it and it can still be notated. So I will play quarter notes on the bass drum and half notes on the snare drum. 1, 2, ready, go. Of course, music notation is often more than just one measure. So when we have multiple measures, they're divided up by what we call bar lines. So here we have 2 measures with repeat signs. The first measure has a whole note and the second measure has 2 half notes. I'll play this exact notation now. It'll be 4 quarter notes in each measure on the bass drum, a whole note on the snare drum in the first measure, 2 half notes on the snare drum in the second measure, and then I'll repeat that whole process again. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, go. To give you another example, here's something different. This is 2 quarter notes followed by a half note, and then the next measure is a half note followed by 2 quarter notes. And of course I'll be playing the bass drum on all 4 quarter notes in both measures. Here it is. 2, 1, 2, ready, go. We're not going to read a whole lot of notation here, but I would encourage you to check out the Zildjian rhythm cards. They are examples of many different types of note values mixed up in all kinds of different ways, and they're a great way to practice your reading. All of the rhythms or note values that we've used so far happen to land right on the beat, but not every note lands on the beat. Some notes are subdivisions of the beat. The first subdivision we'll talk about is eighth notes. Now what this is a single beat divided by 2. So 2 notes per beat. This looks exactly like a quarter note, except it has a flag at the top. And that's the way you can tell the difference between an eighth note and a quarter note. When we're counting out loud, we have the downbeats, which are the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. In between those downbeats, we have upbeats, which we count as and. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And that would be how we count the eighth notes. In this example, we have 4 quarter notes in the first measure and 8 eighth notes in the second measure. So if I were to count that out loud, it would sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. In this example, all 8 eighth notes are written individually with flags. Now, having that many notes in a measure can get a little tricky to read, so we can group 2 eighth notes together using a beam across the top. This makes it a little easier to read, and each beat is defined with 1 beam. Now I'll play the same notation that we saw before, except the eighth notes are grouped together by the beams. So again, we have 4 quarter notes in the first measure and 8 eighth notes in the second measure. And it's counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. It sounds like this. 2, ready, go. In our first beat, we were playing only quarter notes. 1, 2, ready, go. Now, we're going to double what's happening in the right hand by playing eighth notes instead of quarter notes. So, 2 notes per beat in the right hand. Bass drum and snare drum stays exactly the same. 1, 2, ready, go. Now let's try that together. We're going to play a little slower tempo, and we're going to play that same beat with eighth notes on the hi-hat. You'll see it notated here as 2 measures, so we're going to play those 2 measures 4 times, which makes a total of 8 measures of this beat. Here we go, I'll count it in. 1, 2, ready, go. This beat with eighth notes on the hi-hat is a very common beat. You can hear it in all different types of music at all kinds of tempos. So we're going to play it along with different types of tracks. This first one is a little faster than we just did it, so make sure you can play it slowly first. But it's a little faster and it's kind of mellow, so we're going to play closed hi-hat with the tip of the stick on top of the hi-hats just to kind of match the vibe of that song. So here we go. I'll count it in. 2, 1, 2, ready, play. In this example, we're going to play along with a track that's a little more aggressive, so we're going to change our sound to match that. So I'm going to play with my heel up and play a little harder on the bass drum, play a little bigger on the backbeat, and then I'm also going to change the sound of the hi-hats by playing on the shoulder of the stick with a little bit of a sloshy sound. So again, even though we're playing a little more aggressively here, make sure you're staying relaxed in your hands and your posture's good and everything's cool. You don't want to bring any tension into this. Here we go. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, go. That tempo may be too fast for you, and that's okay. You need to practice this beat along with a bunch of different types of music and a bunch of different songs at different tempos. You'll find that some tempos are more challenging for certain beats, and that's definitely a reality that we have to work with. It may mean that you have to work on your single strokes in your right hand to get your right hand up to speed to be able to play a faster tune. That's okay. You can practice that. But it's important that you practice a wide variety of stuff to be as versatile as you can, because this is one of the most versatile drum beats that there is. In our next video, I'm going to teach you a bunch of different beats that are eighth note based with different bass drum variations.